Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Dapeng Liu.
Hi, Richard. I'm so happy to be in this interview today.
It's great to see you there in your studio. Thank you for joining us. And your exhibition is Land Water Shapes at Art Atrium in Sydney. And there's an intriguing range of works in this exhibition, range of approaches, range of styles. How do you find a balance between the long history of traditional art approaches and some of the abstract structures that you're incorporating?
So what I'm interested originally was the traditional Chinese mountain and water landscape painting. That how did the ancient Chinese people see the universe, and how do they see their relationship between the human beings and the natural environment? And so thus, the ancient Chinese masters, they had their way of depicting that. So they usually painted in a larger perspective that contains from the bottom to the top of the mountain, and they planted the little architectures and little people within the landscape. So as a tiny part, a tiny dust in the universe. That's what really intrigued me.
And so how do you decide in your work how much of that traditional influence, that traditional vision and understanding to incorporate?
Yeah, so at the very beginning, I focused more on the technical part. So because the traditional Chinese landscape painting was done by ink and water and rice paper, but I tried to use oil paint on linen. So that put me in the challenge that I need to develop this new technique that allows me to work in this way. As you know, so I work on easel or standing up. The canvas is a different process completely to like you laying the paper on the flat surface and work on it with brush. So that's the beginning. And after I have found the technique that I was pretty satisfied with, I started to seek for change. So I want to simplify. I ask myself, what's really in there that I'm interested in? I think that is the composition and the perspective. So by still focusing on the composition and perspective technique used in the Chinese painting, I changed the appearance of it. I started to use more color. I started to introduce the abstract shapes into the landscape. So because abstract shape is the foundation part of architecture, where we live and we work in all the time. And we see landscape through the architectural space. Yeah. So that's relating to what I'm working at the moment and most of the work in this exhibition.
And in this exhibition, there are a number of different approaches that you seem to have taken. Some works appear really quite close to traditional representation of landscape. Some are something of a blend with geometric shapes, but very clear landscape forms still visible. And some, for example, in the work Uninhabited Space 19, seem to have almost completely disposed of everything but abstraction. How do you feel about all of those different variations being part of the same body of work?
So to me, there is a very clear path. So when I explored on different technical styles. So I tried out different methods, like I use glazing, I use a thin palette or thick palette. I try out different style until I think it's more stabilized at the moment that I feel more comfortable of what I'm doing now. The Uninhabited Space number 19, you pointed out, is actually before I settle down to what I'm working on now. And that state, that result is actually pretty hard to achieve with glazing, and there are a lot of accidental effect in there. So, I'm not sure if that's the one I want to keep doing, but I'm happy with the result. I'm keeping that for myself. But that's a stepstone for what I'm working on now.
You mentioned the idea of perspective, and again, that traditional landscape perspective that was used over many years. The concept of scatter perspective.
Right.
How much do you keep and incorporate scatter perspective into your works now?
I think I've always been keeping the total idea of the scatter perspective, and that's one of my most interested point I drawn from the traditional Chinese painting, because that involves more. So it's different to the perspective technique developed in the Renaissance period, where people try to see what the eye see, which is a single focus point perspective. Where a scattered perspective, or other people call it cavalier perspective, you can stare at different parts of the canvas and you can focus on different points. Thus, the canvas and the work allows you to involve more into one picture, because it's like you are moving in the landscape, but you're looking at different parts of the scenery. You bringing them all into one work. So that's what I'm interested at. Like the work you can see behind me, so it has different levels of horizon. But in the single focus point work, you will always only have one horizon. You won't have a multiple level of that. Yeah, so and this also gives you an illusion of a surreal feeling, that's another result I like.
The elements of abstraction, quite hard-edged geometric shapes that appear in many of your works, you linked to architectural forms. And architecture, of course, is very dependent often on perspective and understandings of perspective. Is that something that you're exploring in bringing in those very clear, hard-edged geometric forms?
So the first time I bring the geometrical form into my work was in the lockdown, because I was trapped. We are all trapped in some sort of architecture space all the time. And so I can only see, the world, the trees and the sceneries outside the house through that space. So there's always something in between. And there are two dimensions, the interior dimension and the world outside. So that's the time I bring geometrical shapes into the work. So I set that as a barrier in between the audience's eye and the actual landscape in the painting. And so if you see through that space in my painting and look into the landscape, it just gives you a different feeling. Yeah, but it does have a connection to the earlier works that I blend the interior space and the outside environment. So that time I was more thinking about, the wormhole, where you step into a wormhole, it's going to take you to another part of the world or the universe. So I had that idea is because after a painting trip into one of the mountain areas in China, because it left with me a strong memory of all the sceneries, amazing sceneries. So after I came back to Australia, all of those images is still linger in my mind. And so, but while I'm sitting back into my studio, so that was the time I want to bring the completely two different parts of scenery from two different parts of the world together into one work. But it certainly has, at the back of my mind, has influenced what I'm doing now.
There seem to be in some of the works elements of both Australian and Chinese scenery. There's certainly one tree that looks as though it might be a eucalyptus tree.
Yeah, very much.
Are you conscious of trying to mix those landscape types together?
Yeah, because, when I do landscape paintings, I can't avoid the process, of sketching, because I do carry a sketchbook around with me. And I'm always so fascinated by the shapes of eucalyptus trees. And the reason is, it's not that dense. You see through it. And that fits into the concept in Chinese garden and landscape design, that they they cut out these different shapes of little windows at the wall, so you can see through that window and you can have a glimpse of the landscape behind it, but not a full exposure. So that's what I like of the eucalyptus trees. So I sketch the trees all the time. I will stop the car, and when I look at the interesting shape one, I'll stop the car, and on the side of the road, I'm gonna do my sketch. So that's where you saw all those eucalyptus trees in my painting comes from. And also another point is, of course, I see oceans and coast every day here in Sydney. So you see much more seawater, coastline, and ocean view in my landscape, which is quite different to the traditional Chinese landscape.
Let's talk a little bit about color. There are some very strong colors in the works which incorporate elements of abstract and landscape. Tell us something about your choice of color and I guess the purpose of color. How are you using color to help us look at the landscapes you're providing?
And it still has a connection to what I did before, because I was doing research studies in art history about, pre-modern and modern art in China and other places. But one thing I noticed is that in the olden days in China, so the artists abandoned color because they can't afford it unless they work for the court. They work for the emperor. Then the emperor will supply all the materials. But for those not that fortunate, they can only have access to ink and water. That's why from very early time, Chinese masters, they abandoned the use of color. And that influenced the artists in China now, I have to say, because that tradition carried on for thousands of years. And so so the reason I use more and more color and I experiment more in color is more like a challenge, and a goal that I set for myself, that I want to step out from that tradition. I just want to explore more, and in color arrangements, in the different possibilities. And plus, in Australia, I can have access to all the different brands of colors. So yeah, I love color and just want to explore more.
And in terms of exploring more, clearly in this exhibition, we can see the progress and the evolution of the exploration that you've been undertaking for some time now. With so much change happening and visible in one exhibition, where do you think the next process of change and evolution is going to take you? Do you know what direction you're heading in from here?
Yeah, I have a rough idea actually, because I always pay attention to environment issues and like this, and also about climate change, all of that. I always have an awareness on this. So I have a feeling that the next step will be something toward that direction. And to work anything in that topic, I can't avoid landscape, even on land or ocean. So I feel like, yeah, in that way.
Well, we look forward to seeing where that engagement with the environment and questions of the environment take your works next time. But for now, Dapeng Liu, thanks very much for sharing your exhibition with us.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.